Imagine waiting days or even weeks to hear a single sentence from someone you loved. In the 1950s, long before smartphones vibrated in pockets and messages traveled instantly across the globe, communication in America moved at a human pace. Words were carried by voices, paper, wires, and patience. For Americans of that era, staying connected required intention, planning, and often emotional endurance. To understand how people communicated without mobile phones in the 1950s is to enter a world where silence was normal, anticipation was constant, and every message mattered deeply. At the center of communication stood the telephone, but it was nothing like the personal device we know today. Phones were usually fixed to a wall or placed on a small table in the hallway or living room. Most households had only one telephone, shared by the entire family. Conversations were rarely private. A ringing phone was an event that drew everyone's attention. Children were taught how to answer properly, using polite phrases, and calls were kept brief out of courtesy and cost. Many families, especially in rural areas, did not even have private phone lines. Instead, they shared party lines, a system where multiple households were connected to the same line. Each home had a distinct ring pattern, allowing residents to recognize when a call was meant for them. Privacy was limited. Anyone on the line could potentially listen in, and gossip often traveled faster than official news. Yet this shared system created a strange sense of community. Neighbors knew one another's voices, emergencies were quickly noticed, and help could be summoned with a single call heard across several homes. Long-distance calls were expensive and treated as special occasions. Calling another city or state required planning and sometimes booking the call in advance through an operator. Families gathered around the phone when a long-distance call was expected, often from a son in the military, a relative who had moved away, or a loved one traveling for work. These conversations were emotional and efficient. There was no small talk wasted. Every second mattered. And when the call ended, people often sat quietly, absorbing the weight of what had been said or left unsaid. For many Americans, the most meaningful form of communication was letter writing. Letters were the emotional backbone of long-distance relationships. They carried news, love, worry, humor, and longing across miles. Writing a letter was a deliberate act. People chose their words carefully, knowing they could not be instantly corrected or clarified. Penmanship mattered. Paper quality mattered. Even the handwriting itself carried personality and emotion. Mail delivery was reliable and frequent, especially in cities where letters could arrive within a day or two. In rural areas, it might take longer, but the arrival of mail was still a daily ritual. Children ran to the mailbox, housewives paused their work, veterans checked anxiously for letters from old friends. A letter could change the mood of an entire household. Good news brought joy that lasted for days. Bad news lingered heavily in the air. Romantic relationships in the 1950s were shaped profoundly by this slow communication. Couples separated by distance relied on letters to maintain emotional closeness. Love letters were often kept for a lifetime, stored in boxes or drawers, reread during lonely moments. These letters documented the growth of relationships in a way modern text messages rarely do. They were physical evidence of love, time, and effort. Beyond phones and letters, face-to-face communication dominated daily life. People spoke to one another constantly, on front porches, in grocery stores, at church, and during community events. Neighborhoods were alive with conversation. News traveled through word of mouth. If something important happened, a birth, a death, a job opportunity, it spread quickly through personal interaction. Community bulletin boards, church announcements, and local newspapers reinforced this network of shared information. The local newspaper played a central role in communication. Newspapers were trusted sources of information, delivering national news, local events, advertisements, and personal announcements. Engagements, weddings, graduations, and obituaries were published and read carefully. For many families, reading the paper together was a daily habit. It connected individuals to the broader world while reinforcing a shared understanding of reality. Radio was another powerful communication medium.
Families gathered around radios in the evenings to listen to news broadcasts, serialized dramas, comedy programs, and music. The radio created a shared national experience. Millions of Americans heard the same voices, stories, and announcements at the same time. Important news, political developments, international crises, major sports events were delivered with authority and seriousness, shaping public opinion and conversation. Television began to enter American homes in the early 1950s, but it was still limited and communal. Early televisions were expensive and often watched collectively, either with neighbors or extended family. Television added images to communication, but it did not replace conversation. Instead, it became a topic of discussion. People talked about what they saw, debated it, and interpreted it together. Communication in the workplace was formal and hierarchical. Memos, typed letters, and in-person meetings were standard. There was no instant feedback loop. Decisions took time. Instructions were followed carefully because clarification was not immediate. This slower pace encouraged responsibility and accountability. Mistakes were costly, and clarity mattered. For emergencies, communication relied on neighbors, local authorities, and physical presence. If someone was injured or ill, help was summoned by running to a neighbor's house, calling from a nearby phone, or contacting local services directly. Communities were tightly knit, making rapid response possible without modern technology. Trust and familiarity replaced digital alerts. Perhaps the most striking aspect of communication in the 1950s was the emotional discipline it required. Waiting was unavoidable. People waited for letters, waited for calls, waited for news. This waiting shaped patience, resilience, and emotional control. Anxiety existed, but it was managed differently. There were no constant updates, no endless notifications. Silence was part of life, not something to be filled immediately. This slower communication also shaped memory. Conversations were remembered because they were rare. Messages were replayed mentally because they could not be revisited instantly. People listened more carefully, knowing they might not get another chance soon. Communication was not disposable, it was valued. Looking back, the way Americans communicated in the 1950s revealed a society built on presence, effort, and trust. Relationships were maintained not by constant contact, but by meaningful exchange. Words traveled slowly, but they traveled with weight. Every letter carried a piece of the sender. Every phone call was a moment shared, not a background noise. In a world without mobile phones, Americans learned to live with distance, uncertainty, and anticipation. They found connection through patience, creativity, and community. While modern technology has made communication faster and easier, it has also made it lighter, more frequent, and often less intentional. The 1950s remind us that communication was once an act of commitment. To speak, to write, to reach out, these actions required time and effort, and because of that, they meant something.